Strategy as a search for comparative advantage. The process that we refer to today as net assessment, or correlation of forces, allows policymakers or strategists to identify their comparative strategic advantages and devise a strategy that capitalizes on their own strengths and the enemy's weaknesses. In Chapter 6 of The Art of War, Sun Tzu makes the crucial yet subtle observation that the art of strategy should be based on exploiting a comparative advantage that enables one to dictate the terms or nature of the war. Fighting on one's own terms requires not only good intelligence, as emphasized by Sun Tzu on many occasions, but also cognizant of the enemy's preferred strategy and his reaction to one's own strategy. Needless to say, the enemy will go through the same estimative process. All other things being equal, the side that completes this net assessment most carefully and objectively and continues to reevaluate and adapt his strategy as the war progresses will succeed by fighting more on his own terms. True to his style throughout the art of war, Sun Tzu provides us with concluding advice on exploiting our comparative advantage. There is no hint of the analytical process that led him to this point. Sun Tzu simply proceeds directly to the recommendation that we identify our comparative advantage and fight on our own best terms. So this is Sun Tzu, Art of War. Therefore, the clever combatant imposes his will on the enemy, but does not allow the enemy's will to be imposed on him. The Griffith, Ames, and Tye translations convey slight variations of the same passage. So Griffith translation, and therefore those skilled in war bring the enemy to the field of battle and are not brought by him. Then the Ames translation, thus the expert in battle moves the enemy and is not moved by him. And then finally Tai Mian Leng translation, therefore a skilled fighter keeps the initiative, but on no occasion lets the enemy's will be imposed on him. In the Giles translation, the commentator Tumu clarifies this idea as follows. One mark of a great soldier or strategist is that he fights on his own terms or fights not at all. A careful consideration of who can impose the terms of battle upon whom may result in one side's decision to avoid battle if possible. Knowing when to avoid battle is as important as knowing when to engage. He who knows when he can fight and when he cannot will be victorious. Sun Tzu. This decision in turn depends upon the quality of intelligence available to the strategist or commander and upon the accuracy of his net assessment. These statements on the importance of identifying a comparative advantage can be correlated with other more indirect statements to the same effect. So, Sun Tzu, The Art of War again, the skillful commander takes up a position in which he cannot be defeated and misses no opportunity to master his enemy. And in another passage, anciently, the skillful warriors first made themselves invincible and awaited the enemy's moment of vulnerability. Invincibility depends on oneself, the enemy's vulnerability on him. It follows that those skilled in war can make themselves invincible but cannot cause an enemy to be certainly vulnerable. The latter statement is a reference to the reciprocal nature of action and reaction in war. For regardless of how well it prepares for battle, one side can never be sure the opponent's counter-moves or mistakes. The shrewd commander selects an advantageous position long before the battle begins. Once favorably situated, he can then compel the enemy to engage him on his preferred terms. So again, anciently, those skilled in war conquered an enemy easily conquered. Thus, a victorious army wins its victories before seeking battle. He conquers an enemy already defeated. I guess I forgot to say that I'm reading from Michael Handel's Masters of War, Classical Strategic Thought, 3rd Revised and Expanded Edition, a classic. Ideally, fighting is in the final and, in a way, the least important phase of a successfully implemented strategy. The process of thinking, planning, and searching for a comparative advantage, not an impulsive rush to engage the enemy, lays the groundwork for victory. For his part, Clausewitz never discusses the need to search for a comparative advantage as the basis for sound strategy and success on the lower levels of war. He engages in a brilliant, systematic discussion of the importance of ascertaining the nature of war and using the Trinity as an analytical tool, but leaves the need to identify one's comparative advantage and to fight on one's own terms as implicit concepts. After all, he who understands the nature of war should also be able to identify his comparative advantages. In addition, Clausewitz's discussion of the relationship between the offense and defense with the comparative advantage afforded by the defense certainly relates to the same concept. If the use of every means, so this is Clausewitz on war, if the use of every means available for pure resistance gives an advantage in war, the advantage need only be enough to balance any superiority the opponent may possess. It is evident that this method, wearing down the enemy, applies to the great number of cases where the weak endeavor to resist the strong. One of the most important elements in this search for a comparative advantage is to make the war relatively more expensive for the enemy. So again, Clausewitz, one question is how to influence the enemy's expenditure of effort. In other words, how to make the war more costly to him. So yet these ideas mentioned by Clausewitz are at best indirectly related to the search for comparative advantage. By contrast, Sun Tzu makes an important and original contribution to the study of war when he explicitly develops this concept. Why engage the enemy on his own terms, where he is relatively stronger, when one can win by exploiting a comparative advantage? If an opponent holds the advantage in conventional warfare, one should wage a prolonged, low-intensity guerrilla type of warfare. If an opponent is highly sensitive to changes in public opinion, one should try to prolong the war as much as possible. If in modern times, for example, one's opponent has a significant advantage in fighting a high-tech war, one must search for a strategy that does not allow him to capitalize on it. Although the history of war from antiquity to the present abounds with instructive examples, only a few will be mentioned here. So Sparta's advantage over Athens in land warfare forced Pericles to search for a comparative advantage. His strategy was to avoid battle by refusing to emerge from behind the walls of Athens in the hope that the Athenians would be able to hold out longer than the Spartans. Similarly, Hannibal's tactical and operational, but not strategic, brilliance inevitably led to the development of Fabius's strategy of avoidance and delay. This continued until the arrival of an equally brilliant Roman general, Scipio, who favored a more aggressive strategy. Led by Scipio, the Romans moved over to the attack in Carthage, where they finally defeated Hannibal. Each of these examples involved a contest between a strategy of annihilation and a strategy of attrition, to use Delbruck's terminology.